Hey everyone, welcome back to the Chain Reaction Podcast, formerly known as the 51% Crypto Research Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Shaughnessy. This is the official podcast of Delphi Digital, an independent research boutique providing institutional-grade analysis on the digital asset market. Today I'm thrilled to have on Nathaniel Whittemore, a friend known famously for Long Read Sunday, his Sunday curation of the top long-form Twitter threads, but he also does strategy and communications for projects. Nathaniel is, in my opinion, not only the best storyteller in the space, but has the best ability at synthesizing down the intent and goal of projects into digestible and understandable words. If someone was explaining rocket science, I would want it to be Nathaniel. In a space where sentiment is king, this is a very relevant podcast episode and one of my favorites. With that, here's my conversation with Nathaniel. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm thrilled to have on a friend that I gained from Twitter, and now he's a close buddy, Nathaniel Whittemore. How's it going, Nathaniel?
Good. How's it going? I love it. Twitter IRL, man. Twitter IRL.
I know. I can't believe how many friends I make on Twitter that turn into real life friends.
Yeah, this is we could probably spend the entire podcast, if anyone ever let me, on the convergence of real worlds and digital worlds, but yeah, I agree. My entire kind of professional relationship with crypto is largely through digital, which is cool.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was at a meetup the other day, and there's like these five guys from a Telegram chat I'm in. I'm like, "Hey, Tom," and I'm like, "How do I know you guys?"
Uh-huh.
Well,
Totally.
Nathaniel, it's a pleasure to have you on. We want to focus this podcast on what you're the best at, and that is on crypto narratives.
Awesome. Yeah, it's kind of a defining topic for me, for sure.
Yeah, agreed. So let's start, I guess, at part one and the stakes. So, what is the breakdown or the framework of narratives for early adopters? How do you think about this for projects?
Okay, well, let's actually take a step back and just talk for a second about what we mean when we're saying narratives and kind of just how to think about them. So when I use the term narrative, what I mean is it's a way to think about not necessarily what things are happening, but how people are interpreting them and what stories people are telling about why those things are happening, what it means that they're happening, and what's likely to happen next, right? So narratives are kind of the story layer that sits on top of real world events that helps people make sense of them and helps people draw conclusions from them, right? And so I've always been interested in narratives kind of across contexts, right? So, my formative years were spent totally focused on social change and social impact. And when I was involved with that, or kind of when I was most involved in that, I guess I would say, there was an interesting shift in narratives from business being the enemy to business being an ally, and business strategies being really useful. This is when, the concept of social entrepreneurship was having a real renaissance and emergence in the aughts and early teens, I guess. So narratives have always been interesting to me. And when I was in college, actually, I studied my senior history thesis was about how Americans understood this civil war that happened in Nigeria in the early 70s, which was the first time that we got involved in a big humanitarian project. And the whole thing was almost entirely about narratives and what stories we were telling ourselves about why what was happening and what our obligation was to it, and so on. So I've kind of always been interested in narratives as this story layer, this explanation layer, this making meaning layer on top of what was happening. And you could look at that across a lot of different contexts. So in Twitter, I think narratives matter, in crypto, narratives matter for a couple reasons. The first, I think, and arguably most elemental, is that money is in a lot of ways a shared belief system, right? It's a system that relies upon narratives for people to agree that things have value and that the value is kind of same and that you can understand it and you can engage with it as such. So I think money as a system is very narrative driven already. Historically speaking. So you kind of have that piece of things, but then you also have the piece, which is just that this is an arena of it's an emerging technology space where the conclusions are far from determined, and in which it's very hard to know what's going to happen next. And so in that context, in the absence of evidence, or I guess we could say before there is good evidence of what happens, there's real fact, there's real information to base things on, all you have is interpretation and kind of narrative explorations of what's happened so far and what it means and what's likely to happen next. So I think there is a huge battle for kind of the overarching narrative of crypto, for specific sub narratives in crypto, and so I mean, we can get into everything from, again, on that highest level, like what is the purpose of crypto? Why are we all here? What are the stakes? Are the stakes money? Are they a world compute? Are they something different? How do those things live together? Are they about the freedom from tyranny of fiat regimes around the world who debase currency? Is it about freedom from the tyranny of big web platforms? Like there's a huge still TBD kind of question around what the overarching narratives of the crypto space are as a whole. But then within that, you also have you have competition in kind of sub areas of narratives, right? Like, so around governance, is governance something that is to be valued? Is it something that's an attack surface to be minimized? You can apply that across basically any part of the conversation that we have around things, or around sort of subparts of crypto. So, I think where we are right now is, we're still pre-usage in some areas, pre-adoption in other areas. Even in areas where there is adoption and usage, it's still largely concentrated on a set of early adopters. And so it's really a battle of narratives, I think, in a big way.
That was an insane intro. I resonate with a lot of what you're saying, and it kind of reminds me of Sapiens when I read that and it found out that money's just a shared belief. I had to read that twice. It just didn't click at first. But I guess going to your first point on shared beliefs driving narratives and kind of the value of projects, where do you draw the line between following a thought leader who's telling a story and following like a Twitter group that's sharing a story about a project? Like, how do you think about the various, I guess, storytellers in the space, and how do you follow them?
Well, that's an interesting question. So a couple things. One is, I think we should always be trying to kill our idols to some extent. And so I think that no one should be followed too much. I think, everyone is still figuring things out. And I find that it's super important to kind of surround yourself with a variety of perspectives. And to me, part of why I spend so much time thinking about narratives and trying to explore narratives is that once you recognize that market narratives are marketing, they are shared by people who have some interest in their narrative or their version of the narrative being correct, whether that's a financial stake or whether that is just sort of being seen as smart or thoughtful or a thought leader or whatever it is. The point of this is not to, the point of recognizing that market narratives are marketing is not to diminish their relevance. It's to kind of turn the volume down, I guess, on how much they influence us. So that's kind of a starting framework for me. So then within that, I mean, I think that there's never been a better time to be able to kind of track and understand the flow of narratives. And I think that largely has to do with, more than anything else, Twitter, but also just what Twitter represents, which is this incredible shared interpretation layer that sits on top of the news, right? So Twitter is where, news and social media more broadly is where news is shared, but it is not the same thing as the role that journalism plays or reportage plays, right? Which is to capture a set of events and play it back to you. The purpose of that social media layer is to give the kind of interpretation on top of it. And I think that the challenge of that is that there becomes a real inseparability between the information and the interpretation. And I think that can be really dangerous. I think that's a root cause for a lot of the challenges that we're facing right now, kind of on a larger societal level. However, if you can piece those things out, what you have access to is this unbelievable. It's like the entire world got invited to the cable news show, and you got to pick the guests that you think are most interesting or right on, right? Or the kind of collective or the collective group gets to be a meritocracy of whose voice rises. And I think that that's really interesting. I think that there's so in crypto for me, it's all about figuring out who's sharing the most interesting perspectives, and then I guess kind of the layer deeper is what are the narratives that they're attuned to? Where did they come from? What's their bent? Again, everyone has a specific set of biases that they're coming from, and it's important to understand that, not only to kind of not in a way to try to cut down or be less interested in what they're saying, but just in terms of understanding better their perspective. So, again, kind of, I guess, summarizing, it's really a lot about finding the right people and then spending enough time with their perspective to have kind of that context as you're watching them speak, as you're watching them interpret.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And Nathaniel, I guess one of the interesting parts that plays into what you're just talking about now is that I just wrote a report on interoperability with Polkadot and Cosmos and Ethereum, and it was a technical report. But when I first started, I thought, oh, Polkadot's just building bridges, like that's what all their marketing materials on. And then I dug into it, and I'm like, wow, this company's really trying to replace Ethereum and Tezos and EOS, and that's all hidden behind a lot of this marketing materials. And that's kind of like the narrative I found, but it took me weeks to figure that out, or days. But how do you deal with like this echo chamber of Twitter that we have? Like, how do we break out of that and get the real stories out, or even just attract the people that aren't on Twitter to the real stories? Because I don't think everybody, I'm doing research, but not everybody has the time to do that and find out these real narratives,
Yeah. So a couple things. I think one, certainly keeping in mind that Twitter, does not represent all of reality and all of the narrative perspectives is important. And in the same way that nor do marketing materials. But I think I actually think that Polkadot is a really interesting example right now. So let's talk about this for a second. So a couple things. So I read your report. I thought it was great. I love all of your reports. Actually, it's especially valuable as someone who lives in the narrative realm to be able to then cross-reference that with those deep dives, right? I think for me, the point of highlighting narratives is not to kind of have call them the exclusive factors in anything or explanatory of everything. It's to understand them as a layer of information that's essential for getting the whole picture, right? So I really appreciate real research. So kudos to you. But so I think. There's a couple things around Polkadot. So one is I try really hard not to assume intent. So you pointed out that that Polkadot seems to be competing actually with Ethereum more than just trying to build bridges to it, and that runs counter to all of kind of what they've put forth from a communications perspective. For me, I think. You can simultaneously say that, hey, the implications of the actions that you're taking and the way that you're building are likely to bring you in competition. There's an inevitable collision course with Ethereum, with the other protocol. And not assume that those marketing materials are meant to somehow disguise that, right? Like one of the things that I think, having been around, young projects and startups for, a long time now, is you don't necessarily own your own narrative totally as a company. And what I mean by that is not that like the market comments on you and they kind of drive understanding, although that's true. It's that you don't necessarily understand all the implications of what you're building when you start. And in fact, I would argue that a lot of the best companies, if you look at the last 10 years of Web 2, the last 15 years of Web 2, started in one area, and then we're nimble enough to realize that the implications of what they built were bigger than what they thought, right? Bourbon turning into Instagram is a great example. Facebook breaking out of college is a great example. These guys didn't necessarily set out to have a master plan. I mean, sometimes people do, different types of companies are different. But the point as it relates to Polkadot is that they could genuinely have set out or currently even believe that they are focused on building kind of this bridge layer between things. And then the implications of where the market is and based on how other projects are developing or not developing is that they actually find themselves in competition with these things. And then the only question is what they do. So I think that it's again, one of the things that I think trips us up sometimes is that when the narrative doesn't, when kind of a company's narrative doesn't match exactly what the implications of that company seem to be, we assume malintent, and I don't necessarily think that's the case. So that's part one that I think is interesting about using the Polkadot case. Part two is that actually in this case, I don't know if you've kind of been watching, but I feel like over the last 2 weeks, especially since Ericon in Berlin a couple weeks ago, social media and the Ethereum community has actually been surfacing that the implications of Polkadot are not just to be a bridge, but to compete. Right? You saw Aragon announce that they're experimenting with building with Substrate at Ericon, and they didn't say they're committing. They didn't say they're switching to Ethereum. But Lane Rettig, the Ethereum core developer, highlighted it right away. And it's like, holy shit! There's a lot of people here talking about Polkadot and building on Polkadot, and maybe Polkadot's actually competitive with Ethereum. Eric O'Connor has been tweeting about this. He actually wrote the other day that he thought it was a huge competitor. So I think the interesting thing there is that in this case, crypto Twitter or whatever, Ethereum Twitter specifically, is actually doing some of that work to surface that the narrative being shared in those marketing materials, or just the conventional wisdom or the historic conventional wisdom or understanding of that project, may not be actually what it's going to, the force that it's going to be in the market. So I think Polkadot's a really interesting example right now, and how the Ethereum community is kind of trying to figure out where they are, and it'll be really interesting to see what Polkadot does, and how they, not only how they respond to that, but just where they decide they want to be overall.
Yeah, that's a lot of great information. And, I don't have an issue with competition. I want these platforms to compete because I want developers to, feet to the flame, figure out what works and attack it. But, the other thing about Polkadot that I'm wondering about from your end is they're currently, I think there's news around that they're raising, selling another stake percentage of their tokens, 5 up to 20%, something like that, at $1 billion valuation. Do you think that there's a disconnect between what they're potentially telling their investors on this bridge theory and then what crypto Twitter realizes is really a platform to build applications on?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if part of why people are taking notice of them has to do with the size of that raise and the valuation that's being reported. It certainly raises eyebrows from one narrative to the other, right? And it may be that that's part of why people kind of took another look and were like, wait a second, what are they really trying to be if we're talking about a $1 billion plus valuation? There's that side of it, and I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. I haven't seen people specifically connect the dots between those two things, but it's not. It wouldn't surprise me if that was part of why it was kind of increasing in the conversation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Daniel, question on that. I mean,
sure.
One of my issues with crypto Twitter is that there's a lot of hand-holding between projects. And, coming from a finance background, I'm always looking for competition and who's going to win and who's going to evolve the fastest. And I've kind of been circulating around this hashtag that the smart contract war is coming, because I want these developers and everybody to realize that, hey, you guys are in competition with each other, whether you like it or not. But I don't feel like that narrative or story is really getting across to people. What do you think about that?
I think that there's I think it's an interesting observation that is important to think through. So one, I don't know that I think that the Ethereum community would agree that it's not combative if you look at how kind of adversarial Bitcoin Twitter is relative to them. And I think that we can talk, and if you want to, we can extensively about how kind of what I think about Bitcoin Twitter's posture relative to other projects and why it is what it is, and how it's kind of I think an adaptive economic strategy in some ways. But I think that in a lot of ways, actually, like if you look at, so I guess two things. One is the part of what has been a historic strength of the Ethereum community is positioning themselves as an alternative for people who want to self-select away from that sort of adversarial type community, and being a different type of space to engage with, right? Like that is actually a net value for a lot of the folks who found themselves in that Ethereum community. So I think in that way, actually, although it appears non-adversarial, in some ways they're taking advantage of it. Just they're positioning themselves at the opposite end of a particular spectrum in order to attract people who find themselves more connected to that way of being, that style of talking, right? So I think that it is a competitive differentiator in some ways, at least in terms of helping people self-select which community kind of feels most resonant with them. Now, then with the context, I think, though, that you're more talking about is the smart contract battle between kind of all of these platforms that are would-be Ethereum killers, and what that looks like. I think that you're starting to see the emergence of that. I think basically, like, look, like until EOS went live last fall or whatever, whenever it was, I guess like August or September. It's really all just theoretical, right? Like all these projects had raised a bunch of money, but they hadn't started to do anything, right? They weren't on mainnets. They were just kind of for the future. Now the future is here. These things are live. They're in production. They're competing. They're doing different types of deals. They have, different types of use cases that are emerging. And so all of a sudden, just they actually exist. And so you have to assume that there's going to be more kind of competition for community devotion and interest. And I think you're starting to see that. I think actually, like, even within the Ethereum community, I think that there is a set of people who are much more vocal. Amin from SpankChain comes to mind about why and how Ethereum needs to be more, kind of aggressive and defensive all at once, and what that means, and how to think about it, and just going so far as to actually commission and then release a report on the state of Ethereum 2.0 that was a real critical look at things that wasn't coming from the outside but from the inside, as a way to kind of try to spark some action into the system, I guess, to try to push things in a different way. So, I think Ethereum has benefited for a long time from kind of being the only smart contract game in town. That is no longer the case, even though they still have a fair number of kind of structural advantages and community advantages and developer advantages and things like that. But yeah, so it's, let's put it this way. For sure, there is going to be more, not less, narrative battle around smart contracts over the coming year. There's just no way around that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, you alluded to your take on Bitcoin's Twitter community versus Ethereum and others. I'm definitely interested to hear your take on that, because it's always seemed adversarial to me, at least.
Yeah, I think it's adversarial, and the question then is why. I'm someone who is kind of falls into this place where I think it's possible to have multiple conversations about blockchain simultaneously. One is about blockchains as money. One is about blockchains as enabling other things like non-money applications, or even not kind of base layer money. And so for me, at the same time, there's kind of nothing in the space that gets me as excited and I think is as truly disruptive as a non-sovereign, non-state, unseizable money, right? That's just for me is when I think from my history perspective. I was always studying the history of conflict and things like that. I think that it's a transformative force potentially in human history, unlike almost anything we've seen in the modern era, unlike a whole lot of technology. So, that's why I'm so interested in Bitcoin specifically. However, I think that there's a huge number of interesting things that I'm really excited to see how play out. Right, I'm really interested in new ways of human organization and DAOs, and what that might enable on similar but different vectors, right, of how people organize in these places that have unstable monetary regimes and unstable political regimes, right? So all of that being said, that's kind of me. I think that within the context of the Bitcoin community, there's a lot of things going on, but one part of it is that this is a community that understands that the possibility that they almost have to be adversarial as it relates to the powerful institutions that exist, right? Like, it is an unbelievable thing to actually really think about the implications of trying to create a money outside of the state system, and I think that we've barely begun to see what the attacks could look like on that. And so I think for that community, they're kind of a little bit more they're attuned to that. They're taking that defensive posture from the beginning because of both their interpretation of the stakes and their belief about what are likely to be the challenges. Now, as it relates to other communities, I think where I find, at least the maximalists that I tend to really respect and like, I found that I think that there's there's an understanding that there's a limited number of resources that can go into this space at any given time. And it is a competition for developer talent, for just kind of entrepreneurial talent for projects. And part of why they're so aggressive about other projects is they don't want this sort of giant sucking vacuum into other places, right? And I think that a part of the last 2 or 3 years of crypto was really defined by the incentives for kind of starting your own token and the seigniorage you can get from that. So I think that it did nothing but validate that stance for them. So, I think that it's a particular type of attitude. I think it comes from a particular sense of the stakes. It comes from a feeling that while things can coexist, there will only be one money. It comes from a sense that money application is the real game, and that everything else is a distraction. And it comes from trying to kind of lure talent to it. So, I think that to me, I guess it feels rational in a way, even if it's not always something I'm still interested in a lot of these other use cases as well. And I'm kind of a support for that. And I guess this is, getting nothing into like actual outright scams and that whole thing, which is, well-trodden territory that I don't necessarily need to get into as well. But I think it's a big piece of that for folks as well.
That's fascinating, Nathaniel. And I just devil's advocate question for you. And I mean, this applies to Bitcoin, this applies to Ethereum, this applies to basically every platform. But when do you feel that kind of like a narrative lock-in takes place? Like, my example here is I know Blockstack is kind of pinning a lot of their state and applications on the Bitcoin network. And I've always wondered why not Ethereum. And my thought process was, obviously they're fans of Bitcoin, but they just go back so long. They've been around so long. When do you feel that like a narrative lock-in takes place where developers kind of are stuck on a platform when in reality they could maybe jump to another one? And this is not picking on any specific platform. I'm just wondering, where these developers get pigeonholed in a way.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And so what I think it comes down to is that this is another important part about narratives. Narratives are absolutely attempts at self-fulfilling prophecy, right? When you're conscious that you are sharing a particular narrative, part of your motivation, in fact, maybe your whole motivation, is to make that narrative real, even if it's a little less real than you say it is now, right? And I mean, like, you look no farther than Mr. Pompliano's Twitter for this, right? Like, he is engaged every day in an absolute war about self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, get off zero. Like, all of these things, all of the slogans, they are about bringing people into a belief system, giving them a kind of like inclusive way to identify. And I think, like I said, recognizing that doesn't legitimate them at all. In fact, it gives them kind of more power in their own way. You understand what the stakes are, what you're going after. So I think that as it relates to your question, though, specifically, there's this really interesting rational economic calculus for anyone involved with one of these communities where, do you double down or do you jump ship, right? Like, how much do you have the ability to drive things in the direction that you feel is best or that you feel is essential, and versus like you just throw your hands up and move to something else. And I think that it's going to be fascinating. To me, that is going to be one of the most interesting questions around Ethereum, particularly if, and this is a big if, this is not me kind of thinking that this is going to happen or wishing that community any ill will, if it continues to kind of the goals, the post gets reset over and over for Ethereum 2.0 or any of these kind of like long-standing projects, will people get fed up and start to go elsewhere? Or will they continue to kind of double down and try to contribute to the value of that community? And I think people are going to answer that really differently, and it's going to be based a lot on what their individual incentives are. And but I think that that's one of the most interesting things to watch is at what point it makes sense for people to kind of double down on things or keep them. And I mean, it's going to be interesting to see. I think every no crypto project that reaches any sort of critical mass of community is going to be exempt from that particular type of question and challenge.
That makes sense, Nathaniel. It's interesting. And my question for you following up on that is, what parties are the first to leave when a narrative goes south? Is it retail investors? Is it developers? Is it the hedge fund managers, the analysts? Who leaves first? Who leaves last?
Well, it should be I think the people, I mean, it should be kind of like last in, first out in some ways, right? In terms of how deeply involved you are, in terms of the depth of your financial commitment, in terms of how, ethos agnostic versus there's a ton of investors who are just here to make money, and that's fine, but I would expect them to have the least kind of durability to the extent that they lose faith in a space, So I certainly think that investors, like almost definitionally, their job is not to support one project or another. Their job is to be stewards for other people's capital. If you're managing other people's money. So I would expect them to be the least. The least kind of the most agnostic about the winner. They want to pick the winners, right? And I think you saw that play out with a lot of the funds that performed well last year. Even ones that were kind of broadly supportive of Ethereum tended to be the ones that shorted Ethereum, or things like that. So I think that it's just the job of the investor, right? Based on who they are. I think developers have a much stronger stake in things, especially now because so much is just being built and so much is being contributed. And really, these networks do require a lot of contribution that is not directly, clearly financially incentivized as just the free markets would have. These are ultimately open source projects that there's limits to how much value you can capture, at least by contributing to the core. And so they really do require a lot of belief. And it's incredibly important. There's a deeper conversation about incentives where I think that sometimes we don't fully appreciate non-financial incentives and how motivating they can be for people. And we make that mistake a lot. Not just in crypto, just in society as well. However, ultimately, you do need a combination of financial and non-financial incentives. But I think developers have a lot more durability, right? I think that they're likely to be the ones who are kind of most committed. And by the same token, I hate it when I use that phrase when I'm talking about crypto. But by the same token, they are also the ones who I think that when they lose faith, the ramifications are the biggest because they fork off and do their own thing. You know what I mean? It's kind of when an investor leaves, it's like, whatever, that's your job. You're going to do that. You're supposed to do that. When a developer leaves and builds something different, the stakes can be a lot higher, and it can actually be much more fracturing. They drag part of the community with them. I think the interesting battle, really what we're talking about when we talk about the battle for smart contract platforms and just the space in general, is the app developer layer, kind of not the core developer layer, and where people who are building projects on top of these protocols are going to take their attention. That's, I think, going to be the interesting conversation over the next year, 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever.
I love that you brought up non-financial incentives. I think that's awesome. And I think that our presence on Twitter and in the media and our followings plays into that a lot. So a question there, I mean, let's take a Bitcoin bull. Let's take Jimmy Song, for example. What are the implications for Jimmy, do you think, if he came out tomorrow and said, if Bitcoin's a global, immutable digital gold, that's fine, that's great. But you know what? I do like what Ethereum's doing, and I like that they're, an application platform. So let's test it out. Let's build on it. Do you think that would fracture his community and his voice, or do you think that would give him more credibility? How do you weigh the financial or non-financial incentives in a scenario like that?
Well, surely everyone is different. And I mean, the easy answer is that you're going to have some people who hate you for it, and a whole new audience of people who don't, And I think that a lot of this is about what what different communities expect out of people who are prominent in them. What does the belief system, what does the narrative system suggest about that type of action, and how forgiving, how permissive is it? Like, these are all really interesting questions that are going to be different community by community, right? Like, I think Bitcoin is a less interested in in that sort of shift, let's say, than some of these other communities. But frankly, like, I don't think that if some prominent Ethereum folks came out tomorrow and were like, you know what, screw it, like, Tom's instincts were right, Polkadot's competitive, and I'm going to go over there and help it beat Ethereum, I don't think that people would be super into that either. However, there's the flip side of this is that there's a certain level of, I think one thing that's consistent is people want consistency. They don't like people in no domain do people like flip-floppers. And I think that the line between being able to evolve your perspective and change your mind and kind of just like running from thing to thing can be pretty small. And that's a real challenge, I think, especially in these kind of what are still effectively a little bit of tribal battles.
That makes a lot of sense. So, Nathaniel, over your time following crypto, how has the narrative for Bitcoin changed? I mean, not just in what we've seen in the media, but like from the developers, from Twitter, from what you're feeling. Like, how's it changed over the past 5 years?
I mean, I don't know about that. I think that the biggest macro shift, and now it's important to caveat this, that there are a lot of folks who believe that this is not a shift. The narrative is always just there. So I want to clarify, make sure that I'm speaking in terms of maybe outlooking in. I think that holding as a use case and the importance of building that network of a store of value has definitely, over the course of the last X number of years, shifted, right? Like, the Bitcoin, when it first made it into the news, it was as a payments channel, because that's what people think about when they think about online money. And they were using the analogies that they had, which is Venmo and PayPal and things like that, right? And so they tried to put it in that box. Now, at the same time, in 2013, 2014, you had Square helping merchants accept Bitcoin payments and things like that, and it kind of fizzled out a little bit. It just wasn't really in demand. And but I think that that's kind of, over the last couple of years, that's been one of the biggest shifts is this real appreciation for holding as a use case. In fact, at middle of last year, Naval tried to bring up a conversation about developer incentives, speaking of incentives, and basically he was kind of arguing that if Bitcoin Bitcoin could benefit from certain types of developer incentives so that people didn't go off and start their own projects, so they could get seigniorage from their custom tokens or whatever. And he unfortunately used the word free rider to describe holders, and as compared to developers and holders. And it set off this very aggressive reaction. And I think part of it was just a particular term that was used, which was meant to be used economically, but kind of came off in the wrong way, I think. But also, it gave people a chance to really dig in and discuss how important holders were to the network. And so I would say that felt to me over the course of last year as a narrative that really emerged into its own in the context of Bitcoin. It became accepted more. Now, it's a lot of folks have suggested and shown how that was always an essential part of the narrative, that it wasn't just cash, that it wasn't just a transaction system, that the decision to emphasize one narrative or another had to do at certain times with the kind of the larger macro, tech climate or economic climate or whatever. So I'm not claiming, having not been there, that the store of value kind of proposition was not an essential piece of Bitcoin from the beginning. However, it did feel like over the course of last year, it really became much more accepted and consolidated around. So that's something that I found really interesting.
That makes a lot of sense. So I guess moving on, Nathaniel, what are the stakes for the rest of the world? For crypto narratives, like whether or not they get involved, whether they do, how do you feel as though we'll attract them? I guess just what's your take on what the stakes are for the rest of the world outside of crypto itself?
Sure. I mean, so we have there's a set of different narrative battles going on simultaneously. One, like I said, is the battle for what the point of crypto is at all, and this is a big one, right? Is it about a sound global money that can't be debased? Is it about distributed computing power that allows people to build applications that won't have you deplatformed and censored? Is it about whatever, right? And even in that context, if it's about all those things, how do they rank? What's the importance? That's I think a really important piece of this of the narrative and the conversation. And part of the thing that makes that so interesting is watching. I mean, obviously, Venezuela is the scenario that everyone likes to talk about right now in crypto, and how kind of Bitcoin is being used as a different as a store of value potentially, or just watching that. And I think it almost, to me, so I think that there's narrative implications and then there's real implications. The narrative implication is really important because it's a place to show that there seems to be at least some evidence that that we're at the beginning of an era, at least, without trying to overemphasize how big a role Bitcoin has in something like the Venezuelan economy. I think that we could at least agree that we now live in an era where there is the opportunity for people to opt out, at least partially, from their state monetary system and have this alternative that exists on the internet. Now, we can debate how ready for that reality Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency is. We can talk a lot, and I think should, about the risk of kind of turning these places into humanitarian aid relief through crypto rather than just economic outlets and opportunity. So there's all these important conversations. However, it to me is pretty undeniable that we now live in a world where Bitcoin exists as an alternative for some. I mean, you still have to be kind of tech savvy, you still have to be digitally connected, but it exists as an alternative to state money, and that's really powerful, and that's really different, and that's has narrative implications, but it's also kind of real world stuff. So this is the stakes when we're looking at the outside world: is like, does the world look at Bitcoin and think still kind of Silk Road hangover stuff and bad guys and things like that, or do they think folks being able to move from Venezuela to Argentina and use Bitcoin to survive, right? That's a pretty powerful narrative shift. So I think there's those stakes, but I think that's a kind of, if you have that on the macro, then within crypto you have this. I think the interesting thing is that, to me, there's these like phases, right? Right now we are still competing for the early adopter community, right? And we're still figuring out, in some ways, we're kind of purging the part of the market that came in for strictly like get rich fast goals last year, right? Or 2 years ago. And that is, that's the place that we are now. But within that context, we have, X number of people who are really interested in the space, the set of early adopters who are interested. And so part of the reason that the battle for community affiliation is really strong is that, if the market of available interest is limited to, the however many people are paying attention on Twitter and kind of getting involved and trying to be around, like, do they care about Bitcoin? Do they care about Ethereum? Do they care about, what do they care about? So we're still, I think, competing for the early adopter community. From there, we're going to be competing for kind of like, what are the use cases that can reach escape velocity and how people know. And so, I think that it'll be really interesting to see. One of the big conversations, obviously, is institutional involvement in this space, and it's this sort of slow burn right now, where things are happening, things are percolating. There has not been a slowdown in the continued learning from big kind of financial institutions about Bitcoin and about crypto. It's just gotten, they've had the chance to kind of the market is calibrated with the way those types of institutions learn anyways, which is slow, ponderously, and over time. And to kind of the projects in those spaces, an extremely frustratingly slow rate often. But it'll be really interesting to see how infrastructure changes kind of create or enable new narratives too, right? Like, so one of the things that is right now, when it comes to those institutional investors and kind of the larger financial world, we get to rely a little bit from a narrative perspective on a lack of some of the key infrastructure being built, right? Like not having good qualified custodians and all this sort of stuff. As a reason that things, they kind of haven't jumped in. Now, should Fidelity come and start custodying things, and no one's actually interested in these assets, like, boy, will that require a narrative shift, and it'll just be a little bit different. So I don't know. It's going to be really interesting. Basically, there's this kind of cool, or at least interesting relationship between reality and narrative that can create these feedback loops where, narrative takes hold, evidence suggests otherwise, narrative adapts, does a little bit of historical revisionism, and then we move on to the next thing. And I think that's just kind of there's a really important narrative cycle that happens. So I think 2019 is going to be a lot about that as it relates to kind of on the one end of the spectrum, institutions, and on the other end of the spectrum, the real kind of human use case of particularly Bitcoin in less than ideal scenarios.
That's great. And yeah, your idea on the continued learning definitely resonates with me. One of my mentors, Tim McDonald, it's TR McDonald on Twitter. He always told me when I was debating starting a crypto research biz, the first day you get started, you're a day ahead of everybody else and a week ahead of everybody else just to get started. But, back to your point on Venezuela, Bitcoin's always been, purported as a, global sound money. And that always made sense to me. But I always thought that we have such large geographical differences. Like, if I'm sitting in my house in America, kind of building the next gen of applications is really, interesting to me. But if I'm in Venezuela, I really want to protect my wealth. Do you see that the narratives are different, per geography? It just doesn't seem like something that'll ever be connected on a global scale. I feel like we're always going to have these differences.
So first, absolutely, there's no denying that the experience of what Bitcoin and crypto assets mean is going to vary wildly based on where you are. There's no denying that. Now, I think that part of this big communication infrastructure that we have, in Twitter, allows us to break out of kind of the natural bubble that we exist in and understand that. And that is, if you look historically at, okay, actually, let me go back into history for a minute, because I think this is actually really relevant and is something that's very special and good and positive about now. But if you look historically, the only way that people have understood difference is by having that difference reframed in the context of their own experience and connected the dots. So before I moved to San Francisco, I almost went to the UK to do a PhD in history, and I was going to study the history of the British abolitionist movement. The British abolitionist movement was the first time in human history that a massive group of people organized for someone other than them, other than themselves, and for a group that they didn't belong to, basically. And it was really interesting because that movement, it basically started with the Quakers, and for 20 years, the Quakers, from a kind of religious and moral perspective, were beating down the door of British society, saying this is immoral and you can't do this and it's horrible. And then it took the involvement of kind of a different class. So there were some key figures who got involved. And then once that group got involved, kind of the landed political class, or at least two kind of very, the two most prominent figures in that were one guy who was well known and has had lots of movies made about him, named Wilberforce, who was an MP, and another person who was arguably more important, who's less known, named Thomas Clarkson. Thomas Clarkson was the guy who's read about, or who kind of rode like 500,000 miles going between different town meetings and connecting Basically, he connected the plight of slaves with the emerging plight of the emerging industrial class, and he connected the dots between. He basically made the argument that this is a spectrum of human debasement that goes, from you to you in these factory conditions to these slave ship conditions, and it's actually how many steps away are we? And so Britain became the first kind of the major the major nations in Europe to ban the slave trade, and then obviously in America, actually kind of continuing the story and moving it forward. There was one of the things that really helped the American abolitionist movement take root is when former slaves started writing publications in their own words. And so they were putting things into a language, into stories that people could understand as part of their own experience, not as something separate. And so fast forward, this is the very origins of how people started to relate to one another in groups of difference. You can see this pattern play out across the history of kind of humanitarian aid and people getting involved. But what we have now, and it's obviously still on a less dramatic level a little bit, but we get the ability to listen to people who are framing their experience in a literal language that we understand, and actually explain it. And so, an amazing example of this is Eduardo Gomez, he's Venezuelan. He left. He basically used Bitcoin to survive. He worked for a Bitcoin company, or he works for a Bitcoin company, and from there he was able to kind of get himself and his family to Argentina, and has been a really important voice as crypto has learned about the situation in Venezuela, because he can contextualize it. He is both of the Venezuelan community, and passionately so, and he is also of the crypto community and speaks Bitcoin and understands it. And so he becomes a bridge for us all to understand. And then he's elevated. He was on off the chain with Palm, and that brings him to a whole new audience. So I think that it's really important to understand that there is a pretty significant difference in the experience that different people have, while at the same time recognizing that there's never been, literally ever, a better time to actually understand other people's experience than there is right now. So I don't know. I'm kind of I'm pretty optimistic about our ability as a crypto community to be able to keep these multiple different contexts in mind all at once.
That's an awesome journey and a great mental frame of reference that we now have. I appreciate that, Nathaniel. And just moving on to a little bit of different topic while I have
Sure.
you. When do you think that, I watch a lot of movies, Prophet's Prey, Spotlight, those are all kind of religious, culty kind of movies. Spotlight's another one. When do you feel as though, or how do you even realize if you're in a crypto or a project that's becoming like a cult? Like, how do you realize that, and how do you potentially get out? I know it's a hard question. I'm just wondering. I mean, I think at some point, some of these projects are going to turn into like religious cult followings if they're not already.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I think so. Here's the thing. I think the thing that's hard is that most people who find themselves in that, well, I don't know. I don't know if I'll go that far. A fair number of the people who would find themselves in that situation, in the kind of cultiest part of a community, were probably looking for that. And so it's extra hard to get themselves out of it. So here's something that I thought was really interesting. Neeraj from Coin Center tweeted today. He said, a thought from someone reflecting on the quality of crypto Twitter. And it's like a shot of a message from some app or something. I don't know, WhatsApp or something like that. And the message that he shared was, giving people a financial incentive to self-organize into tribes is turning out to be way more interesting than I would have imagined. So again, I think going back to this idea of narratives as self-fulfilling prophecy is, people have a really strong incentive to push their community right now, right? To compete for the available attention and resources within this sort of early adopter crypto community. So to some extent, it's hard sometimes to know how how much the cult-like behavior is real versus strategic, but I don't know. I think that, like, for me, certainly the best way to escape that is, look, I'm a big believer in following, and this is crypto particularly, but anywhere that you can do it, like following the smartest people that you disagree with. I feel like creates a very healthy, healthy way to not be trapped into sort of the cultism of some of these communities.
That makes sense. So a lot of this narrative talk plays really well into governance, where stakeholders on a network, developer, token holders, miners, those running nodes, have to make real decisions. And on Bitcoin, there's a lot of signaling and a lot of following of thought leaders, which is fine in my opinion if they're right. But in other networks, it's kind of becoming easier to do in a way. Like on Decred, you could vote with your tokens and you could see the results in real time. So you don't have to guess which is most popular. Everybody has like an easier way to vote. So I guess there's two things to unpack here. I mean, as governance becomes more of an issue and changes these networks happen, do you think narrative takes center stage there, or do you think it's more much of the same that we've seen?
I think it's a combination. So I think narrative and governance do have an important role together, and I think actually, interestingly, Bitcoin is strong evidence of this to me. So there is a narrative of governance of Bitcoin that it is governance is basically an attack vector. And so it's kind of that surface area should be minimized as much as possible. I think that is widely believed, and actually is one of the things, that belief about governance, and maybe that is kind of partially a hangover from political beliefs outside of crypto as well. But whatever the case, that is a belief about governance that actually attracts people to the project, and it makes them willing to participate. Right, like for them, the messy inefficiency of certain types of decisions is a good thing, because the default position when the goal is, the overarching goal is to not mess up, to not go down, to not screw up, has to be conservatism, right? In terms of kind of changes and things like that. So, I think that there's certainly narratives have an important role in governance in terms of people self-selecting kind of the broadly speaking, the approach to governance that makes sense to them. I think that you're likely to see more. This year is likely to see a lot more governance narratives competing for people's devotion, right? Like, again, now that a lot of these protocols are live and actually doing real things, all of a sudden there's something to have governance about, and so they potentially compete in a kind of an intellectual market for governance, where people affiliate on the basis of what systems make sense to them. Now, in that context, though, obviously, like, ability to understand governance is a major challenge, or rather, like, to understand what the difference between Decred versus Definity's governance is versus whatever, right? To really understand that, and then there's obviously so I guess that, like, I'm pretty convinced that governance narratives are going to matter, or at least people are going to try to compete on the basis of them. I think there's a lot of other challenges, though, as well, when it comes to I guess two things that stand out to me are one, for let's say that a project has been able to really explain its governance well, and people get it and they're bought into it. Two things stand out. One is the actual infrastructure for governance and how easy it is to participate is a major barrier. So even if you have, like, very optimistically 75 or 80% of your community, like, opted in, at least in part, because they understood and got your governance, how do they actually vote? Is it easy? Is it hard? What do they do? What do they need to do to participate? Like, those are real questions and challenges, I think. So there's a very practical kind of user experience level to governance as well, where even if a narrative takes hold, it still matters. And then a third piece is around incentives to vote and participate. And I think this is going to be kind of, I wouldn't be surprised if this actually is even more important in some ways than governance narratives, which is, based on the governance models that people have, do they feel like they have enough of an ability to influence things and make a difference that they actually participate? Or do we have a situation where, low voter turnout like reinforces and reenshrines the kind of the downside of plutocracy, which is that basically if you have a holdings based voting system and the people who have the greatest holdings have the most to gain or lose on the basis of any particular decision, and then they're the only ones to kind of participate in the voting, it becomes this very kind of it's a positive feedback loop with a negative outcome, where highest stakes in the decision kind of drives decisions towards those areas, which leads people to disengage further, and yada yada yada. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more experimentation, not just around the narratives for governance, but for the incentives, right? Like, it wouldn't surprise me at all if someone comes out with a protocol and is like, nope, like voting is mandatory. You're going to have your stakes slashed and things like that. So I don't know. I think it's going to be really interesting though. They're all attempts at coordination systems at a scale that we kind of haven't seen for a while. So it's going to be pretty cool to see.
Yeah, the governance debates are really interesting, and following along with the projects implementing them are even more so interesting. And my take is just that it's going to be really hard to implement governance systems once cryptos get larger. And I mean, we're seeing 0x do this. I think they're having a token vote soon, but they never really had governance in their system, and that was a huge pushback. But just moving on, Nathaniel, I mean, recent news out, we got to discuss it. Pomp and Jason Williams and Mark Gesko have their $40 million fund backed by 2 pensions, which I thought was a huge signal to the space. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I actually completely agree that this is a big deal. I actually did a stream about it on Periscope this morning because I think that I wanted to make sure that people had the significance of it. So there's a couple things. One is just from a like, hey, this is a bear market that people are still able to raise a $40 million venture fund, and that's good news, right? It means that interest hasn't completely left. Which is awesome, but that's kind of like baseline awesome. The much more interesting thing has to do with the fact that that it was anchored by a couple of pension funds, and so kind of what I was riffing on Periscope was that if you look at the LP base, the limited partner base for venture funds, they have a few different components, and kind of on one end of the risk spectrum, the maybe the most risk tolerant, you have things like family offices where they're exactly as risky as the high net worth families and individuals that they represent. And so, not all of them are particularly kind of risk tolerant, but some of them are, right? Especially if someone has a particular interest in a new space or an emerging space like crypto. So a lot of the kind of institutional engagement around crypto has been driven by family offices and family office folks who really kind of stepped up and helped other family offices learn about it. David Nage, who's now at Arca, was kind of running family office stuff before and did a ton of work to get family offices comfortable with crypto over the last couple of years. So you have that part of the institutional investor spectrum. Now, then kind of somewhere in the middle, maybe from a risk perspective, you have endowments. University endowments are a huge area of kind of venture capital LPs historically. And so last year there was a lot of excitement when Yale made an investment in a couple of different crypto funds, I think, including Paradigm, which is Fred Ersham's fund, the guy who was previously a co-founder at Coinbase. That was exciting to folks for the reason both that an endowment was getting involved, but also because David Swenson, who runs Yale's endowment, is particularly influential in that space. The university endowments watch what, in particular, the kind of the top biggest endowments are doing very closely. So that was a big deal from a signaling perspective. Then pensions are kind of farthest on the risk adversity spectrum in most cases, and that's good reason for that, right? Like they're dealing with people's livelihoods, not kind of just broad capital markets and people trying to make money. It's folks who just need to have kind of their wealth preserved and increased so they can live out their lives. So it's natural that that's a group that's going to be much less risk tolerant than other groups. And so the interesting thing is that my strong instinct is that there are lots of folks who are looking at even in that pension space, across the institutional investor landscape, but even in that pension space, who are looking across crypto and saying, this is a really interesting hedge against a lot of what's going on in the larger markets, and it's a non-correlated asset. And in fact, there's reasons to think that it does kind of, it performs in certain types of, economic turbulence that we might experience. And, I think a hedge there could be really interesting. Now, the question is their incentives and how far they can push. Those individuals can push their, whatever bodies they invest with. And I think that one of the things that's really important is to, again, coming back to incentives, to remember individual incentives, right? Like there are cool incentives to be the first, in an industry to really get something, right? Like you can make your career on a bet that does well. However, there's far more in the way of disincentives to leave from kind of the herd and the conventional wisdom should things go poorly, right? Like there's not going to be probably a lot of people who get totally fired for not investing in crypto last year, right? There's going to be hopefully like a few people who get fired in the future for not having invested in crypto this year. But I think a lot of us who are excited think that in 3 to 5 years, if you're not in yet, that's actually going to be a mistake. And so the question is, where in the spectrum are we? And part of what matters about pensions kind of coming out publicly as LPs in a fund like this is that it creates more cloud cover for those individuals who are already interested in crypto to say, hey, look, this is starting to be a thing. And I think we should make a small allocation. So I think that the news is much more significant than just Morgan Creek, although it's very exciting for them. And I'm super stoked for those guys. I think it's much more about creating more space for more institutional investors across kind of all of those different categories to say, hey, let's actually do this thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of my last questions for you, Nathaniel, is on that vibe of pension funds. I mean, pension funds manage 25 billion, something crazy number like that. I'm thinking off the top of my head from a tweet I saw earlier. How do we attract, like when we're in those conversations with those pension funds, are they going to care about Bitcoin's block reward and transaction fees, or are they more interested in uncorrelated asset, hedge, risk averse, diversify?
Caveat is that I don't know, having not sat in those meetings, but I can give you my guess, which is that the best care about both in the reverse order of what you just said, which is that this needs to clear muster from the framework of what makes sense to them and what their needs are, right? Like this is an uncorrelated asset. They're interested in the hedge against, dollar losing its status as a reserve currency, like whatever it is, whatever their investment thesis that this might fit into has to be paramount to some extent, because that's what they're basing their investments off of, those narratives that they've got, that they understand based on their experience in the market. So it has to match that narrative to some extent. Otherwise, it's just why would you invest in it? Which is why I think a lot of you see a lot of investors talking about what Bitcoin and what other assets mean relative to the larger market context. So that's part one. I think that the best investors are going to care about those other issues, the kind of the things that feel more micro, that feel within the ecosystem of a particular asset, because those have to do with, the equivalent of those questions in Bitcoin is the equivalent of looking at, if you're going to make a big investment in a currency in a country, what's likely to happen politically in that country, right? These are things that have that impact your belief about the durability of the asset, the long-term future of the asset. Now, of course, with investors, it's possible, like everything is about time frame, right? So it's possible to have someone who's, very skeptical long-term, but thinks that for the short term, Bitcoin is going to be the kind of center of the crypto markets, and they're likely to grow as global kind of instability grows. So, I think that good investors want to know everything, and I think that to pass through the first layer of like, is this something that I should spend my limited time on? It has to match with a narrative that they have about where the markets are headed. But from there, they're best investors go deep.
That's interesting. And Nathaniel, where can people follow you before we close out? And definitely tell people who aren't aware about Long Read Sunday.
Yeah, so I am my kind of the main presence for me everywhere is at NLW on Twitter, and that links out to my website and everything else. But yeah, I every Sunday I curate kind of the best long form Twitter threads, in particular, in some essays, into what is called, or was come to be called, Long Read Sunday. It goes out, without fail. I haven't missed a week yet, and I think this will be week 34 coming up. And it's hopefully it's a good way for people to catch up on not just the news layer, but really that kind of interpretation layer. And the prompting for it was really just seeing such a huge percentage of insightful things that I was reading about and learning were coming in the form of Twitter and Twitter threads. And the thing that's great about them is that they get right to their audience. They don't have to click out for anything else. And they allow, I think, people to be a little bit more off the cuff and less well refined, which means you get kind of a higher portion of ideas, even if they're not fully developed out. But they go away really fast. They don't get kind of cataloged or kept anywhere. And so I started it to keep track of those really interesting pieces of information and threads that otherwise might get lost. And it's going strong, 34 weeks later. So hope to see you on Twitter on Sunday mornings.
Nathaniel, this has been an awesome podcast on positioning, storytelling, narratives. I really appreciate your time, and I can't wait to share this one.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please rate, review, and share the podcast to help other people find it.